I never expected the HOA's illegal bridge across my property to become my ticket to millions, turning their power play into my ultimate victory. What would you do if your neighbor's invasion of your land suddenly became your path to financial freedom? I watched in shock as strangers in yellow vests measured across my stream. My hands shook with anger as I rushed down the hill toward them. This was my land, paid for with 15 years of overtime shifts and careful saving. The beautiful 3-acre wooded property with its gentle stream. It was why I chose Willow Creek Estates, despite the strict HOA rules. I specifically picked this spot because the property maps showed it was private and secluded. "Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing on my property?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. A worker glanced up nervously. "Just following orders, sir. HOA approved this bridge project last month." "What bridge?" I asked. Nobody asked me anything about a bridge. My peaceful morning had transformed into a nightmare in seconds. "You'll need to take that up with M. Winters," the worker added, pointing toward a woman in a bright red blazer directing others near my property line. Margaret Winters, the HOA president, stood with her trademark pearl necklace gleaming in the sun, clipboard in hand, issuing commands like a general. As HOA president, Margaret had developed quite the reputation for getting her way, regardless of who objected. I marched over, property deed in hand. "Margaret, there must be some misunderstanding," I said. "You can't build anything here without my permission." She barely looked up from her clipboard. "Oh, James, the board voted unanimously last month. This connecting bridge will improve community access to the park and raise everyone's property values. The notice was in the newsletter." I stood there stunned. "I never received any notice. More importantly, you're building on my land without permission or permits. That's illegal." Margaret's perfectly lined lips curved into a condescending smile. "Don't be dramatic. It's just a small footbridge that benefits everyone. Why would you stand in the way of community improvement? Besides, the stream area falls under our easement rights." "No, it absolutely does not," I snapped, pulling out my property documents. "I have the survey right here." Margaret waved them away without looking. "We've already allocated the funds. Construction starts tomorrow morning. I'm sure once it's finished, you'll see how lovely it is." My blood boiled as I watched her strut away. 3 nearby neighbors quickly turned their heads when I looked in their direction. They'd been watching the whole confrontation. That evening, I contacted my friend Sophia, a real estate attorney. "They can't just build on your property," she confirmed after reviewing my documents. "Your deed is clear. You own the land to the north edge of the stream. I'll draft a cease and desist letter immediately." Despite the letter Sophia delivered the next morning, construction equipment appeared before dawn. I photographed everything. The excavator digging into my protected wetland area, workers hammering posts into my stream, and Margaret supervising it all with a smug expression. When I approached the crew with my cease and desist letter, they looked uncomfortable but continued working. "We're just following orders," the foreman repeated, not meeting my eyes. By week's end, concrete footings had been poured on both sides of my stream. Each day, more neighbors wandered over to watch the progress, some giving me cold stares as if I was the villain for objecting. I filed a formal complaint with the county zoning office. But the next day, I found my mailbox stuffed with angry notes from neighbors. "Stop blocking progress," one read. "Think about others for once," said another. Margaret orchestrated a whisper campaign against me. At the grocery store, families who once chatted with me now hurried past. Parents at the community pool gathered their children when I approached. Someone even spray-painted "selfish" on my mailbox. "They're trying to isolate you," Sophia warned. "It's a pressure tactic. Don't engage directly. Document everything." I installed security cameras around my property, capturing footage of Margaret leading small tours of neighbors along my stream bank, proudly pointing at the half-built bridge. "The bridge will connect our community like never before," I overheard her telling them. "Imagine walking straight through to the park without that long detour. If only some people weren't so stubborn about sharing." 2 weeks into construction, I noticed something odd. County surveyor marks appeared overnight, extending well beyond where I thought my property ended. When I checked my deed again, I realized Margaret had been working with outdated property maps. I hired my own surveyor, who confirmed my suspicions. Your property line extends 12 feet beyond where they're building. They're actually encroaching more than they realize. Armed with this information, I approached Margaret at her home, survey results in hand. The bridge isn't just unauthorized, I said. It's extending much further onto my property than you think. Margaret's face tightened. Surveys can be interpreted different ways. The community needs this bridge, and we're building it. Perhaps if you weren't so new here, you'd understand how things work in Willow Creek Estates. How things work, I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. You mean ignoring property rights? She shut the door in my face, her smile now replaced with a scowl. The next chapter would prove that my confrontation with Margaret was just the beginning of a much bigger battle, one that would change everything. The night after Margaret slammed the door in my face, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with a million thoughts. I'd always been the kind of person who played by the rules, avoided conflict, and valued peace. But now my land, the peaceful haven I had worked so hard for, was being invaded by people who didn't care about the rules. It wasn't just the bridge that bothered me. It was the way they dismissed my rights and trampled over everything I had worked for. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee and paced around my living room, I received an unexpected call. "Is this the homeowner fighting the Willow Creek Bridge project?" A woman's voice asked, her tone professional, but not without warmth. "Yes, that's me. Who's calling?" "Emily Richardson, County Environmental Inspector. I received your complaint, and after reviewing the situation, there's something you should know. That stream on your property is part of a protected watershed. Any construction here requires special permits, which they don't have." My heart skipped a beat. "Wait, you're telling me they don't have the right permits?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. And based on what I've seen, they're in violation of environmental regulations." A surge of hope rushed through me. "Can we meet tomorrow?" Emily agreed, and I hung up the phone, feeling the weight on my shoulders lift slightly. Maybe this was the turning point I needed. The following morning, I met Emily at a local cafe. She was as sharp and professional as I had hoped. As we sat down with coffee, she flipped through a stack of papers she had brought. "Based on the evidence I've gathered, the construction has disrupted protected wetlands. It's a direct violation of county code," Emily explained, pointing to the documents. "The fines for this could be substantial, and if the environmental damage is extensive, they could be facing a lawsuit." I leaned forward, my heart racing. "This could really work in my favor?" Emily nodded, her eyes narrowing with determination. "You've got leverage, James. If you play this right, you could stop them in their tracks." I was finally starting to see a way out of the nightmare Margaret and her HOA board had created. Emily advised me to gather as much documentation as possible. Photographs, videos, and witness statements. Armed with this, I could put real pressure on the HOA. When I returned home, construction had progressed rapidly. Trucks lined the street, and a dozen workers were on site, bolting steel beams into place for the bridge. Margaret was there too, standing with the HOA treasurer, her hands proudly resting on the blueprints as she gave instructions. I approached the site with a calm smile, trying not to give away just how much this moment meant. "Good afternoon, everyone. The bridge is looking lovely," I said, my tone surprisingly friendly. Margaret's expression shifted from surprise to suspicion. "Had a change of heart?" she asked, her voice dripping with mockery. "Let's just say I'm seeing the bigger picture now," I replied smoothly. "By the way, did you get permission from the Army Corps of Engineers? This waterway falls under their jurisdiction." The treasurer paled visibly. "You said that wasn't necessary." Margaret, however, snapped, "He's bluffing." "Perhaps," I said, keeping my voice light, "but you might want to check federal regulations before making that claim. But please continue building. I'm fascinated to see the finished product." As I walked away, I couldn't help but notice the confusion in their eyes. For the first time, I had shifted the dynamic. Margaret was no longer the one with all the power. I knew she was rattled, but I also knew this wouldn't be over until I had everything in place. Emily's advice had set me on the path to make the HOA's illegal project crumble, and I was determined to see it through. The next week, I met with my lawyer and shared my growing collection of evidence. We filed an emergency injunction to stop the construction, but the HOA had made powerful allies. Margaret had called in a favor with a judge, delaying the hearing. Construction continued. Every morning I watched as the bridge took shape, knowing that time was running out. The stakes were rising, and I needed more than just evidence. I needed to act fast. One evening I received an unexpected call that would change the game entirely. A man named Thomas Reynolds, a local real estate developer, had been following my situation with interest. He told me that the bridge had potential value, millions of dollars to the right buyer. I was stunned. Thomas suggested we meet the next day. When we sat down at Oak Street Coffee, he slid a folder across the table. The township has been trying to connect their trail system to your neighborhood park for years, he explained. This bridge creates the perfect link. But here's the kicker. Only the property owner can grant the access rights, not the HOA. I flipped through the folder, feeling the weight of his words. The township had been eyeing the land for years, and now the bridge could complete a vital connection. But I held the key to unlocking it, and the township was willing to pay handsomely for that access. You're saying that the HOA inadvertently built something incredibly valuable, but only I control its use? I asked, trying to wrap my head around the opportunity. Exactly, Thomas confirmed. The township has already budgeted millions for this connection, and they've been trying to get it for years. For the first time since this nightmare started, I smiled. This wasn't just about fighting the HOA anymore. This was about turning their mistake into an opportunity for me to make a fortune. As I walked away from that meeting, I knew I was holding all the cards. Margaret's bridge, which had been built to walk over me, was now my ticket to financial freedom. The next chapter would reveal how I played my cards, carefully documenting every violation along the way, while keeping my eyes on the bigger prize. The morning after my meeting with Thomas Reynolds, I felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt in weeks. I now had the upper hand, and I was ready to use it. I couldn't believe how quickly the tides had turned. What had initially seemed like a simple dispute over property had evolved into something much bigger, a fight not just for my land, but for something with millions of dollars at stake. I arrived home to find the construction site bustling with activity. Workers were installing decorative railings and the lighting for the bridge. The sound of power tools and hammering filled the air, a constant reminder of the impending threat that was being built on my property. But now I wasn't just watching helplessly. I had a plan, and the next few days would be crucial. I needed to make sure everything was documented. Margaret and the HOA had made a monumental mistake by building this bridge without the proper permits, and I was going to make sure the world knew about it. I contacted Emily again. I need every piece of documentation you have on the environmental violation, I told her, and I need it fast. She was on board immediately. Within a few hours, she had sent over everything I needed: photos of the wetland disruption, reports confirming the lack of proper permits, and the environmental fines they were facing. Each day, the construction continued. The fines were mounting, $10,000 per day. By the time I had gathered all the evidence, I realized the HOA had already racked up hundreds of thousands in fines, and they didn't even know it. Armed with this information, I approached my attorney, Sophia. I think it's time to escalate this, I said, my voice steady with determination. We're going to make sure the HOA can't get away with this. Sophia agreed, advising me to file an official complaint with the Environmental Protection Agency and the county zoning office. I filed the complaint that same day, ensuring that I had everything in place for when the authorities responded. Meanwhile, I continued to document everything. Every single violation, every broken rule, every bit of construction that had been done without permission, photographed, logged, and ready to be presented as soon as the time was right. The tension in Willow Creek Estates was palpable. Neighbors who had once given me friendly nods now turned their faces away when they saw me. I had become a pariah in the community, the villain for standing in the way of what Margaret had convinced them was progress. It was almost as if they had forgotten who owned the land that the HOA was trespassing on. It became clear that Margaret was playing the long game. She wasn't going to back down easily. She was too powerful, too influential in the community. But what Margaret didn't know was that I had something she didn't: truth on my side and a well-documented case that would crush her and the HOA. I received a call from Emily the next day. James, I've got news for you. The county environmental inspector is taking this seriously. I've just heard that they're planning to conduct an official site inspection. My heart skipped. This was the break I needed. Within hours, a team from the county arrived at the construction site. They were led by an inspector named Officer Rivera, who had been working with Emily on the case. As they began their assessment, I quietly approached the group, keeping my distance so I wouldn't interfere. I overheard snippets of conversation that confirmed my suspicions. The construction was illegal. They hadn't obtained the proper permits from the Army Corps of Engineers, and worse, the construction had disrupted a protected wetland area. I watched as the inspectors took notes, measured the construction, and snapped photographs. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I knew this would set the stage for what was coming next. That night, I received a call from Thomas Reynolds. "James, I just wanted to check in. How's the situation going?" he asked. "It's about to get interesting," I said, grinning. "The county inspectors are on site, and they're gathering evidence. Once they report back, this bridge is done for." Thomas's voice grew excited. "Well, I have some good news for you. The township is already considering making an offer on your land. It looks like they're really interested in this trail connection. They've got the budget set aside for it, and they're ready to act." I felt my pulse quicken. This was it. I was on the verge of a deal that could change everything. Over the next few days, the pressure on the HOA continued to build. Margaret, who had once seemed invincible, was now rattled. She stopped by my property several times, but each time, I stayed inside, watching from my window as she paced back and forth outside, speaking with workers and making frantic calls. Finally, the official inspection report arrived from the county. It was devastating for the HOA. The report outlined the violations, the lack of proper permits, and the damage done to the protected wetland area. The fines were substantial, and the HOA was now in jeopardy of being sued for environmental damage. I knew this was my moment. I had to act fast. The next day, I went straight to my lawyer, Sophia. "It's time to put the pressure on," I said. "I'm going to meet with the township and make them an offer they can't refuse. But first, we need to stop this bridge from going any further." Sophia was on board. "Let's get the paperwork ready. We've got a strong case, and we're going to take down the HOA once and for all." I called Thomas immediately, letting him know that I was ready to sell the land to the township. The offer was on the table: $7 million for the land and the rights to the connection. The township had the funds, and now it was just a matter of negotiating the deal. The HOA's mistake had become my opportunity. As I watched the construction workers pack up their equipment and leave, I realized that Margaret's bridge had been the key to unlocking my financial freedom. The bridge that had been built to walk over me had instead elevated me to heights I never dreamed possible. In the next chapter, I would take the final steps towards securing my future, turning a battle over a bridge into an opportunity worth millions. I stood at the edge of my property, watching as the construction site emptied. The workers had begun packing up their tools. The bridge that was once so close to completion, now a half-built skeleton. My pulse raced as I stood in the center of this quiet battlefield, knowing that the next steps I took would either solidify my victory or set the stage for a prolonged legal battle. The next day, I met with Thomas Reynolds, the real estate developer who had been the first to see the hidden potential of the bridge. He had been instrumental in making me realize just how valuable this piece of land could become. He had connections, the right information, and the experience to turn a problem into an opportunity. When I walked into the meeting, Thomas was already waiting at the table with a smile on his face. "I'm glad to see you're ready to move forward," he said, extending his hand. "I'm not just moving forward, I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I'm taking control." We sat down and Thomas immediately got to the point. "I've spoken with the township, and they're still very interested. They've already set aside the budget for the land, and they're ready to make an offer. They're offering $7.5 million now. If you agree to the deal, we'll start the paperwork." I couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement. The township had upped their offer, and now this deal could be even more lucrative. It was hard to believe how far I had come. From fighting to protect my land to now negotiating a multi-million-dollar deal with a township, I had turned a nightmare into an incredible opportunity. "I'm ready," I said, my voice steady. "But there's a catch. I want the agreement to include environmental protections for the wetland area. This needs to be a sustainable project. and I want to ensure it's preserved for future generations. Thomas raised an eyebrow, impressed. You've thought of everything, haven't you? I want to make sure I'm not just getting a financial windfall, I explained. I want to protect the land that's been in my family for years. The township has already agreed to make the park a public nature preserve. Let's make sure it stays that way. Thomas nodded in agreement. I'll pass that along to the council. It'll be a good move for everyone. After our meeting, I immediately called Sophia, my attorney. The offer's up to $7.5 million, I said, trying to keep my excitement in check. And I want to add an environmental protection clause in the deal. Sophia was ecstatic. You've done it, James. You're turning this whole situation into a win. I'll get the contract drawn up right away. That evening, a different kind of pressure began to mount. Margaret and the HOA board had been silent, but their silence spoke volumes. I knew they had heard the rumors of the township's interest. I also knew that this was the moment they would either fold or fight back in desperation. The phone rang at 8:30 p.m. It was Margaret's husband, Jack. I was surprised, but I answered the call. James, I'm not sure how to say this. Jack's voice was hesitant. But I want to talk to you about the bridge, about the land. There's been some confusion, and, well, we may have made some mistakes. I leaned back in my chair, intrigued. Go on, I said, my voice cautious. We've heard about the offer from the township, Jack continued, and I've spoken to Margaret. We're willing to offer you $100,000 for the easement. It's more than fair. You'll make a good amount of money and keep the community intact. I felt a rush of satisfaction. The HOA had always been so certain of themselves, acting like they held all the power, but now they were the ones scrambling to salvage their reputation. You think $100,000 is fair? I asked calmly. After all the trouble you've caused, after all the violations you've committed on my land, it's too little, and you're in no position to make demands. You've been breaking the law for months, and you want to offer me $100,000? There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Jack spoke again. We didn't know it would escalate like this. It's not just the HOA, James. Margaret's led the board for years. She's powerful, but we're trying to find a way out of this. You've already made your bed, I replied coldly. Now you're going to lie in it. The conversation ended soon after that. Jack clearly wasn't in the mood to negotiate further, and I wasn't interested in hearing more empty apologies. I had what I needed. The township's offer was significantly higher, and it wasn't just about money. It was about setting things right. The next day, the township council formally extended their offer to purchase my land for $7.5 million. They agreed to the environmental protections I requested and assured me that the bridge would be removed and replaced with a proper structure downstream. The plan was to turn the land into a public nature preserve, providing access to the park and connecting trails for the entire community. It wasn't just a win for me, it was a win for everyone. Margaret and the HOA were left with no choice but to accept the legal reality. The township was the one with the authority now, and no amount of manipulation could change that. Margaret, who had once acted like she owned the neighborhood, now had to face the consequences of her overreach. I signed the agreement with the township, officially transferring the property and the easement rights. The next morning, I woke up to find a huge deposit in my bank account, $7.5 million, minus a portion for taxes and the environmental trust fund I had set up for future land conservation. As I looked out at the now empty construction site, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The bridge, which had been built to walk over me, had ultimately led to my financial freedom. I had taken control of my future, and now, instead of fighting against the system, I was part of something much bigger. The bridge was gone, but the legacy I left behind would be one of progress, preservation, and the power of standing up for what's right. In the next chapter, I would witness the fallout for the HOA and Margaret, but I was already looking forward to what lay ahead. The next chapter of my life, free from the constraints of Willow Creek Estates, and filled with opportunities that I had once thought were beyond my reach. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. The ink on the agreement had barely dried before the ripple effects of my deal began to spread through Willow Creek Estates. News of the township's purchase of my property spread like wildfire, and the HOA's role in the fiasco became a topic of heated conversation. Neighbors who had once sided with Margaret and the board now began to question the decisions they had blindly followed. As the township moved forward with their plans to develop the nature preserve, the fallout for the HOA and Margaret was immediate and intense. The first sign of trouble came during the emergency board meeting, held just days after the deal was finalized. I had received an invite from Eleanor, the neighbor who had apologized to me at the meeting. She had become an unlikely ally in this fight, someone who had seen the light and realized how badly Margaret had mismanaged the situation. The new interim HOA president, Ted, was calling for a community-wide vote to address the issues that had arisen during Margaret's tenure. The room was filled with tension when I arrived at the community center. Most of the seats were taken by concerned neighbors, but when I entered, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Some people looked at me with curiosity, others with unease. They were still processing everything that had happened, how Margaret had misled them, how they had been complicit in allowing this disaster to unfold. Ted stood at the front, his voice steady but firm. "We're here to address the fallout from the bridge project and the mistakes made by the previous board. Our community needs to move forward, and that means admitting where we've gone wrong and working together to rebuild trust." He glanced at Margaret, who was sitting in the back of the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had arrived alone, and it was clear from her posture that she was no longer in control. Her once immaculate appearance was disheveled, her confidence shattered. For the first time, Margaret seemed small, vulnerable even. "The first order of business is to review the actions taken by the previous board and how they have affected the community," Ted continued, his eyes scanning the room. "We're also going to vote on a proposal for HOA reforms to ensure this doesn't happen again." Margaret's face reddened as murmurs rippled through the crowd. She was used to being in charge, used to silencing opposition with a well-timed word or glance. But now she was on the defensive, surrounded by people who no longer trusted her. "I'm sorry, but I just need to clarify something." A neighbor named Laura stood up, her voice laced with frustration. "The HOA approved building on James's property without even checking if it was legal? You didn't even make sure all the permits were in place? How could you have done this to him and to all of us?" Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but the words faltered. We thought everything was in order," she stammered, but there was no conviction in her voice. "No," Laura shot back. "You didn't think anything through. You just pushed ahead with your agenda, disregarding everyone else." More voices joined in. The questions kept coming, accusations flew, and for the first time in years, Margaret found herself without the power to control the narrative. Her reign as president of the HOA was crumbling before her eyes, and it was all her doing. The meeting continued for hours as residents vented their frustrations and shared their concerns. It became clear that Margaret's leadership had caused deep divisions in the community, and many felt betrayed by her. There was a growing consensus that things needed to change. The final vote was swift. Ted and the new board members proposed several key reforms to the HOA structure, the most significant of which was the introduction of a transparent approval process for all future projects, especially those that impacted residents' property rights. There would also be term limits for board members and no more unchecked power for a single person. Margaret's resignation was inevitable. With no allies left on the board, she stepped down in disgrace, and Ted was elected as the new president. The room erupted in applause as Margaret silently walked out, her departure marking the end of an era for Willow Creek Estates. As the meeting wrapped up, I found myself at the center of the room, once again an outsider in a neighborhood that had once been my home. But this time, things were different. I no longer felt like I was fighting an uphill battle. The township's plans for the nature preserve were moving forward, and my financial situation had changed beyond anything I had ever imagined. Later that night, I received a call from Eleanor. "James, I just wanted to thank you again for standing up for what was right," she said. "I know a lot of people in the neighborhood are still upset, but they're starting to see the bigger picture. You didn't just fight for your land, you fought for the whole community." I smiled, feeling a sense of pride that had eluded me for so long. "I didn't just fight for my land, Eleanor. I fought for fairness, for transparency, for the future of this place." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that made me pause. "You know, I heard Margaret's husband, Jack, talking to a few people after the meeting. He's trying to get support to have her reinstated as president. He said she's been with the HOA for years, that she's the one who really understands how things work around here. I sighed. That's the last thing this neighborhood needs. I agree, Eleanor said firmly. I just wanted you to know that some of us are standing with you. We're done with the old way of doing things. It was comforting to hear that people were beginning to take responsibility for their part in the situation. They were slowly starting to understand the damage that Margaret's leadership had caused, and they were ready for change. The following weeks were a blur of meetings with the township, where the final details of the nature preserve were ironed out. The new bridge would be constructed downstream, and all the necessary environmental protections would be put in place. I'd also arranged for a portion of the funds to be allocated to the Wetland Conservation Trust I had set up earlier, ensuring the preservation of the ecosystem for future generations. The day I signed the final papers with the township, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The battle had been long and hard, but it had been worth it. I had fought not just for financial freedom, but for the future of my property and the community. The neighborhood was changing, and I had played a part in making sure it changed for the better. In the weeks that followed, I watched as Willow Creek Estates slowly began to heal. The community was rebuilding, with new leadership in place and a renewed focus on transparency and collaboration. Margaret's shadow no longer loomed over the neighborhood, and I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that I had played a key role in making that happen. As for me, I was no longer bound by the limitations of Willow Creek. My new life awaited, one filled with new opportunities, new challenges, and the financial freedom I had worked so hard to achieve. But I would always carry with me the lessons learned from this battle, the importance of standing my ground, the power of information, and the undeniable truth that sometimes the most unexpected turns in life lead to the greatest victories. And with that, I took my next steps into a future filled with possibilities, far beyond the reach of any HOA. It's strange how quickly things can change, how a single event can reshape the course of your life. Just months ago, I was an ordinary homeowner in Willow Creek Estates, working hard to protect the land I had sacrificed so much to acquire. Now I stood on the brink of a new chapter, one I never could have imagined when I first bought the land. As I watched the workers from the township begin their preparations to transform my old property into a public nature preserve, I felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction. What had started as a fight for my rights had turned into a legacy, a project that would benefit not just me but the entire community. The wetland was being preserved, the trails were being expanded, and the bridge that had caused so much tension was now a symbol of the neighborhood's renewal. No longer just an obstacle in my path, but a connection to something greater. Yet, even as I enjoyed the fruits of my labor, I knew this victory wasn't just about the property, the money, or even the preservation of nature. It was about reclaiming power, the power to stand up for myself, to navigate adversity, and ultimately to make decisions that would impact my life for years to come. I had fought for what was mine, and now I had the chance to start fresh, free from the constraints of Willow Creek Estates. In the weeks following the community meeting, I settled into my new rhythm. The nature preserve was becoming a reality, and with it, the value of the surrounding properties began to rise. I could see the change taking root. People in the neighborhood were beginning to come together again, not just to rebuild what had been broken, but to grow something better. Ted and the new board were determined to keep the momentum going, introducing new initiatives to encourage collaboration and trust within the HOA. The old oppressive atmosphere that Margaret had cultivated was slowly being replaced with openness and community spirit. Yet despite the newfound peace in Willow Creek, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of something bigger. The money from the township's buyout had changed my financial situation, and I knew that with the right planning, I could use this as a stepping stone to further my goals. The vision I had for my life had shifted, from fighting to keep what was mine, to embracing a future of possibilities I'd never thought possible. One morning, as I sat at my desk reviewing some financial statements, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something told me it was important. I picked it up. "Hello, James?" "It's Thomas Reynolds." I sat up straighter. "Thomas, what's going on?" "I've been following the progress of the Preserve project closely," he said, his tone upbeat. And I think it's time we had a more serious conversation about what comes next. You've done something incredible with that land. But you also know there's a real opportunity here. I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I've got a few investors interested in land development in this area, Thomas continued. The park's success is already bringing in traffic, and I think we can capitalize on that. We're looking at a major commercial development that could transform the region, resorts, hotels, restaurants, even residential properties. But it all hinges on your involvement. I let his words sink in. My mind raced. A major development. Investors. It felt like a dream, but a dream that was grounded in the reality of everything I had accomplished so far. Let's talk, I said, my voice steady with excitement. I'm listening. Over the next few weeks, Thomas and I met several times discussing potential development plans. The idea was ambitious. Take the newly established nature preserve, which was already attracting attention, and create a sustainable, upscale resort area that complemented the park's natural beauty. It wasn't about mass development. It was about creating something that would enhance the landscape, attract tourists, and elevate the entire region. Thomas believed in the project. He believed in me. And as we discussed the details, it became clear that this could be the next step in my journey, a way to turn my newfound financial freedom into something even greater, something that would leave a lasting impact on the area. The development was to be an eco-friendly resort with small luxury cabins, walking trails, and spaces for outdoor activities, all designed to coexist with the nature preserve. The project would bring jobs to the region, contribute to the local economy, and support conservation efforts in a way that made the most of the land's natural assets. I took the time to carefully weigh the options. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about making a difference. My experiences with Willow Creek and the township's plans had taught me the value of sustainability and responsible development. I knew that this new venture could provide an opportunity to help others, while also ensuring that the integrity of the land I had fought so hard to protect would remain intact. After a few weeks of back-and-forth negotiations, I made the decision. I signed the partnership agreement with Thomas and his group of investors, marking the beginning of an exciting new chapter in my life. The resort project launched with tremendous community support. As the development progressed, it became clear that the vision I had for the future was coming to life. I watched as the resort's cabins were constructed, blending seamlessly into the landscape. Walking trails were laid out, and new paths for hiking and biking were established, all leading to the nature preserve. The park, once just a piece of land I had fought to keep, was now a centerpiece of the community's identity, a place for everyone to enjoy. I was involved in every step of the process, overseeing the development with an eye toward sustainability. It wasn't about creating something extravagant or over the top. It was about creating something that felt like part of the land, that respected the environment and benefited the people who lived nearby. As the months passed, the resort became a success. Tourists came from all over to experience the natural beauty of the preserve and the resort's eco-friendly amenities. The local economy thrived, and property values continued to rise as more people discovered Willow Creek Estates and its surrounding areas. It wasn't just about the financial rewards, though they were substantial. It was about knowing that I had created something lasting, something that honored the land I had fought for. The decision to develop the resort had been the right one, and I could see its positive impact on the community every day. Looking back, I realized that everything had come full circle. From the moment Margaret and the HOA tried to build that bridge, I had felt like I was on the defensive, fighting to protect what was mine. But I had turned that fight into a triumph, something that had not only transformed my own life, but had the potential to improve the lives of everyone in the community. I had stood my ground, and now I was reaping the rewards. My journey had come full circle, from a battle over land to the creation of a legacy that would last for generations. As I walked along the newly constructed trails, surrounded by the natural beauty I had fought so hard to preserve, I knew that the path I had taken had led me exactly where I was meant to be. This was just the beginning. In the final chapter, I would take one last look at how far I had come, and how the power of standing up for what's right could change the course of a life forever. As I stood at the edge of the newly developed Willow Creek Nature Preserve, watching the gentle breeze ripple through the trees, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come. The land that had once been just a quiet sanctuary had now been transformed into a vibrant community asset, thanks to the township's vision, the resort development, and my persistence. It was more than just a financial success. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when you stand firm for what you believe in. I had spent years trying to protect my land, trying to preserve the quiet peace that had drawn me to Willow Creek in the first place. I never imagined that a fight with an HOA could lead to this. But here I was, not only financially free, but part of a larger plan that was benefiting the community and future generations. The lessons from this journey had shaped my perspective in ways I couldn't have predicted. There were days when I wondered if the struggle had been worth it. The pressure, the isolation, the constant legal battles, it had been exhausting. But now with the nature preserve thriving and the resort attracting guests from all over, I could see the bigger picture. I hadn't just fought for myself, I had fought for something much greater. The old Willow Creek Estates, with its petty disputes and overbearing HOA rules, was gone. The community was now united, focused on sustainable growth and preserving the natural beauty that had always made the area special. The new leadership within the HOA was transparent and open, and there was a sense of pride among the neighbors in the preserve's success. As I walked down the main trail surrounded by the lush greenery, I thought about the journey that had led me here. From the first confrontation with the HOA, to the shock of finding out the bridge was on my land, to the eventual negotiations with the township, the path had been long, but every challenge had prepared me for the next step. The final victory was not just the money I'd earned or the success of the preserve. It was the knowledge that standing up for my rights, for my property, for what I believed in, had ultimately led to something far bigger than I had ever imagined. It was about doing what was right, even when the odds were stacked against me. I had learned the hard way that sometimes you have to fight for what's yours. It's not enough to hope things will turn out in your favor. You have to actively protect what you value. Whether it's your property, your beliefs, or your sense of fairness, there will always be forces that try to take it away from you. But as long as you stand firm, keep your integrity intact, and fight with everything you have, you can transform even the most difficult situations into opportunities for growth and success. The lesson I took from this experience was simple. Never underestimate the power of persistence and the value of standing your ground. The world may try to push you down, may try to make you feel small, but if you know who you are and what you stand for, you can turn any setback into a setup for something greater. That's how I turned a small piece of land into a legacy, how I transformed a bridge built to walk over me into the very thing that elevated me. It was never about the bridge, the HOA, or even the money. It was about the principles I held on to when everything seemed stacked against me. I chose to fight for what was right, and in the end, it changed everything. As I stood there watching the families walking through the preserve, I felt at peace. The land was thriving, the community was thriving, and I had learned that sometimes the biggest victory comes not from the fight itself, but from what you do with the strength and wisdom you gain through it. And so, I left Willow Creek Estates behind, knowing that my journey was far from over. There would always be new challenges to face, new opportunities to seize, and new ways to make a difference. But the lessons I had learned from this fight would stay with me for the rest of my life. The end. The lesson. The story of Willow Creek Estates is one of perseverance, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. No matter how daunting the challenges, when you hold firm to your principles and continue to push forward, you can transform adversity into opportunity. The journey may be long, and the road may be filled with obstacles, but if you remain true to yourself and the values you hold, the rewards, whether personal, financial, or emotional, will far exceed the struggle. Sometimes the hardest battles lead to the greatest victories, not just for yourself, but for those around you as well.